What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the new horror film Suitable Flesh, directed by Joe Lynch, starring Heather Graham and Barbara Crampton. And this is based on the short story The Thing on the Doorstep by the legendary horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. And the movie's in limited release right now, but it's also already available on video on demand. And it'll be coming to Shudder in January of 2024. And the reason I wanted to talk about this flick, first and foremost, I love bringing attention to low-budget horror films, but more importantly, talking about this movie opens the door to so many other topics that I really enjoy, like movie adaptations of the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, specifically those starring Barbara Crampton, directed by Stuart Gordon back in the 1980s, namely The Reanimator and From Beyond. I absolutely love those movies. If you've never seen Reanimator and From Beyond, those are two of the most deranged, out there, just balls through the wall, insane fucking horror movies of the 1980s. And in the 1980s, there was a lot of healthy competition on that front. But there's so much about Suitable Flesh where you can tell it's almost trying to be like a spiritual successor to the spirit of those movies, but at the same time very much doing its own thing. But if you've not seen the trailer for Suitable Flesh, I'm going to say this. The red band trailer for Suitable Flesh, I think it's one of the best goddamn trailers that I've seen in years. So much so, perhaps it creates unrealistic expectations about just how good this movie might end up being. Like, I like this movie. I didn't love this movie. And I totally get it if some people were disappointed by the movie because the red band trailer is just that goddamn good. But if you're unfamiliar with the premise, here is the one-sentence synopsis from IMDb. A psychiatrist becomes obsessed with one of her young patients, who she later discovers is linked to an ancient curse. That's very vague, and I think totally doesn't do the trick when it comes to capturing what the premise is. So instead of using that subpar synopsis from IMDb, instead, let's use the synopsis offered by H.P. Lovecraft when describing the original short story upon which this movie is based. And according to Wikipedia, the idea for the story came to Lovecraft from a dream he had in 1928, which he wrote down in his commonplace book as, "Man has terrible wizard friend who gains influence over him, kills him in defense of his soul, walls body up in ancient cellar. But," in capital letters, "the dead wizard who has said strange things about soul lingering in body changes bodies with him, leaving him a conscious corpse in cellar." So that gives you a rough idea of some of the ideas being explored in this movie. And I would argue that this movie at best is like a loose adaptation of the short story. But I should also admit, it's been quite a while since I read the original short story, The Thing on the Doorstep. I revisited the audio fiction version last night just as a little refresher. But to be fair, there are very few strict adaptations of H.P. Lovecraft out there. Like, my favorite H.P. Lovecraft stories would be like the Dunwich Horror and The Color Out of Space. Obviously, Call of Cthulhu is an absolute masterpiece. The Rats in the Walls is a personal fave that I really enjoy. But even when it comes to the best adaptations of Lovecraft on the screen, most of those movies tend to be very loose adaptations as well, which brings me full circle to The Reanimator and From Beyond. I'm going to try not to make this just into like kind of an indirect review of those two movies. But those two movies, they get my highest possible recommendation just because they come from an era where filmmakers like Stuart Gordon recognized if you're dealing with a limited budget, then you have to put something on the screen that you would never see in a mainstream Hollywood movie. And Reanimator, goddamn, that movie just fucking goes for it. I mean, you want to talk about wildly inappropriate, offensive content that'll make people's hair fall out when they see it today, but when you watch it, it's like, there's no denying just like the infectious glee that you will feel while watching a movie as like deliriously strange and unhinged as Reanimator. It truly comes from a bygone era. And I would argue that Suitable Flesh, it's reaching for that. It doesn't quite get there, but I admire the attempt because there's so much about this movie that they really get right. And Joe Lynch is a director where I'm kind of familiar with his work, but only a handful of his films. I've seen Wrong Turn 2 Dead End, which is completely insane, and I've seen Knights of Badassdom. But Joe Lynch also, he works as an actor quite a bit as well. But with nearly every single creative choice that he makes here with Suitable Flesh, you can tell that he's reaching for that great heyday of Stuart Gordon and Reanimator, etc. and so forth. But basically you have a situation where Heather Graham plays a psychiatrist. She meets a patient. This patient claims that somebody's trying to steal his body, and suddenly she finds herself in this wildly inappropriate affair with one of her patients who may or may not be getting possessed by his father, which prompts a visit to the father, who spends all day reading all these ancient tomes filled with all these horrible illustrations of people like Cthulhu and whatnot. I feel like if you're familiar with the Cthulhu mythos, or if you've read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft stories, there are little details from different stories that have been kind of like sprinkled throughout the movie. But because of all this ancient forgotten lore that's being read and studied in all these ancient tomes, suddenly you have a situation where a lot of people are swapping bodies and doing very randy, horny things while in those bodies. And I just found myself cackling with glee watching Heather Graham in her 50s, just throwing all caution to the wind. And this is an actress where I've been watching her on the screen since License to Drive back in like 1988. Like, she's an actress where quite literally I've had a crush on her for 35 years. I think I was 12 years old when I saw License to Drive, and then I followed her into movies like Drugstore Cowboy, obviously movies like Boogie Nights. Like in the late 90s, suddenly Heather Graham was fucking huge. She just exploded. But I've been absolutely in love with her, like the world's biggest celebrity crush for many, many decades at this point. And Jesus Christ, she still completely, totally does it for me. And it's not terribly often where you see an actress in her 50s suddenly embracing a role where she's going to be inhabited by the mind of like a creepy old man performing very strange sexual deeds with her husband. Like, it takes us into very strange sexual terrain where it's like you don't even know like what their sexual orientation is, because if you're a man inside of a woman's body making love to another man, like, I don't even know what that makes you. But this movie is very broad-minded when it comes to who's fucking who and so on and so forth. But like, there's this diabolical, devilish glee to the way Heather Graham approaches the role that I just found absolutely fucking hysterical. But what helps make the whole circle feel complete is that her co-star is Barbara Crampton, who's appeared in most of the best H.P. Lovecraft adaptations. And Barbara Crampton, at this point, she's a true legend in the horror genre, and I love the fact that she's still getting after it. And like Heather Graham, she seems totally game for some truly deranged, violent scenes in this. But I don't want to fall into the trap of overpraising a movie just because I like what it represents. Because for me, horror and sex go together like chocolate and peanut butter. Like it's a perfect harmony, and you almost kind of can't have one without the other. And throughout the 1980s, there were many, many movies that were willing to scratch that itch. And who knows, maybe that's why I grew up into the person that I turned out to be. But this movie does definitely have some flaws. I mean, first and foremost, there are some budgetary constraints which lead to Joe Lynch kind of repeating and reusing certain devices over and over again. Like when people are switching bodies, the first time there's a situation where people are switching bodies, he kind of gets away with it. But as he reuses the same sound effects and the same extreme close-ups over and over and over again, that device gets very tired. But more importantly, I don't think the movie's quite as outrageous or shocking or provocative as Joe Lynch would like to think that it actually is. And who knows, maybe he very deliberately kind of tapped the brakes. It's like, look, we're going to explore this strange Lovecraftian terrain, but we're not going to completely gross people out and send them running out of the theater. But I feel like if you're going to put Barbara Crampton in an H.P. Lovecraft adaptation, you kind of have no choice but to just go for it. Like even Stuart Gordon might have crossed the line when he made Castle Freak. And the reason I mentioned Castle Freak is that it has one scene where even I was like, oh, God. Like, y'all might have actually crossed the line. And if you've seen Castle Freak, you know exactly which scene I'm talking about. And who knows, maybe there's some people out there who are like, fuck you. Like, I love that scene. But for me, there was one scene that was like truly stomach churning, which mixes nudity, sexuality, and cannibalism all into one scene where I was just like, I don't know if I can handle this shit. But I should also acknowledge that trilogy of H.P. Lovecraft adaptations directed by Stuart Gordon, every single one of them was adapted by Dennis Paoli. And I can't believe I've gotten this far into my review without mentioning the writer Dennis Paoli, because this is a true kind of unsung legend in the world of horror. And he didn't work exclusively with Stuart Gordon. I mean, he worked with Abel Ferrara on films like Body Snatchers, but this is a guy who, like, he wrote Meridian, the movie starring Sherilyn Fenn, but he did write Reanimator, and he did write From Beyond. So nobody knows better, like, what makes these movies tick? Like, what goes into the DNA of making these truly memorable horror experiences? And I guess the only thing that's missing from the DNA of this particular movie, perhaps they could have used a little bit more money, and obviously they could have used Stuart Gordon. I mean, I think Joe Lynch did the absolute best job that he possibly could, but Stuart Gordon is just one of those diabolical maniacs that comes along every once in a while that is really, like, kind of is willing to go to the dark side of one of my favorite genres. But sadly, he died back in 2020, and I'm sure he would have loved to have been reunited with one of his most reliable screenwriters and brought this movie to the screen. But as much as I might be cautious about not wanting to oversell this movie, I'm also not going to be overly critical, because I was very entertained by this movie. I had a big, stupid smile on my face while I was watching it. I couldn't believe some of the absolutely filthy dialogue that was sprinkled throughout. I mean, there's at one point, Heather Graham says something to her patient like, I want you to come with me. And he's like, no, I'm going to come inside you. I was like, whoa, all right, we've gone back to the 80s in a flash. Like that was truly gross. Like, let's see where this scene goes. And as it turns out, where that scene was willing to go was into some truly kinky territory. And I think this whole movie would have fallen apart if not for the fact that Heather Graham is doing everything in her power to deliver this completely, totally unhinged, insane, like very sexy and very dangerous and very disturbing performance as different people inhabit her body. And I would say some of the crazy garish expressions she makes throughout the movie are far more disturbing than some of the actual gore that we see on display in the flick. I mean, the flick's bloody and it's got some gore and it's got some really gross stuff toward the end. I was like, woof, all right, we're starting to almost get into like kind of Castle Freak territory. So I'll just leave it at this. The movie is very watchable. The movie is very enjoyable. I think it's well worth watching, especially if you're a Lovecraft aficionado. Every once in a while, someone will come along and make a very solid Lovecraft adaptation like The Color Out of Space. But of all the Lovecraft adaptations I can think of, Suitable Flesh is definitely in the conversation as one of the good ones worth watching. I guess the reality is the best Lovecraft movie that I've ever seen. Hang on, I gotta look up the title real quick. Lovecraft documentary. Lovecraft Fear of the Unknown from back in 2008 was absolutely incredible. And you've got interviews with Guillermo del Toro, who famously tried to get Mountains of Madness adapted into a film for many years. But you got interviews with John Carpenter, you got Stuart Gordon, you got Neil Gaiman. You got all these incredible writers and filmmakers talking about their love and affection for the stories of H.P. Lovecraft. And I've probably read somewhere between like 10 and 15 Lovecraft stories. I almost feel like a bit like a poser, like I kind of pretend to be more of a Lovecraft expert than I actually am. I love Lovecraft, but I have like 4 or 5 stories that I always go back to and keep rereading as opposed to exploring more of his oeuvre. But I do think this movie will be entertaining to quite a few people. But more importantly, if it excites people about going back and seeing Stuart Gordon's adaptations of Lovecraft in the past, then I consider that an absolute home run situation. And I hope that people will continue to explore the work of Lovecraft for many years to come. But for me, there's just something very innately appealing about a movie where like Miskatonic Medical School in Arkham, Massachusetts is a real place. And speaking of which, hang on one second, I've got to retrieve something. Sorry about that. I had to do a quick wardrobe change into my Miskatonic University t-shirt, because I'm a big, giant dork who loves Lovecraft perhaps a little bit too much. I can't believe I was wearing a Stanley Kubrick t-shirt throughout that entire video. I'm sure Stanley Kubrick, well, I have no idea if Stanley Kubrick had any opinion on the work of Lovecraft, but obviously this is the t-shirt I should have been wearing for this particular video. But I don't know how much I can say without giving away any spoilers. I guess I probably should acknowledge that there are some other actors in this movie. Judah Lewis, I would say he's very game. Maybe his performance as Asa White, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his name. Maybe it's a little all over the place, but he's just hurling himself into every crazy scenario in which his character finds himself. Bruce Davison was pretty good in this as well. I always enjoy seeing Bruce Davison in anything. Jonathan Shaik, he's pretty good as Heather Graham's husband. Actually, there's one scene where he's really good where we see how he responds after having sex with his wife when there's been somebody else inhabiting her body, and seeing the way he responds with like total excitement of how it's like it's opening up all these doors. Anyway, that scene was particularly funny. In any event, this is Halloween weekend, and if you're looking for a cool, deranged horror experience that's not Five Nights at Freddy's, I mean, Five Nights at Freddy's, I never played the video game, so I had no interest in seeing the movie. I hear that the movie is very kid-friendly, and apparently it's making vast sums of money, and I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted that so many people are back at the theaters enjoying that movie, but everything I've heard about it makes it sound like something whereas I might have liked it when I was 10, but I'm just too old and weird and perverted to enjoy a movie like Five Nights at Freddy's these days. However, if you like your horror to go to dark, strange, unpleasant places, Suitable Flesh might do the trick. I'm not going to claim it's some new masterpiece. I'm not going to claim that it goes quite as far as I would have liked it to, or perhaps as far as Joe Lynch might think they are going. But goddamn, I was entertained, and I might even watch it again. And the trailer, once again, just to get the trailer. They could have basically kept the movie like, tucked away in a vault. I could have just watched the trailer over and over again and been totally happy and delighted with the concept of Suitable Flesh. But that's all I've got to say about this particular movie. I've actually got to skedaddle because I'm going to go see The Holdovers in the theater. But if you like this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. But more importantly, as always, well, happy Halloween and onwards and upwards.